And we're recording. All right, welcome everybody. So first, I want to just start off our talk about resumes this evening with a little bit of background of where I'm coming from in my approach, because there are different philosophies on how resumes and interviews are best conducted. I'm coming to you from the perspective of someone who uh, has really changed how I write resumes over time and done job interviews, in part because I'm a teacher and it's quite a competitive field and there's quite a lot of it's not uncommon to have many hundred people apply for the same position. So there are quite a few courses and workshops I've taken to try and improve that. But also I've had the pleasure of working at camp, sitting on the other side of the table and receiving a lot of resumes and interviews and having to decide on who do we choose to build the team. And that has been perhaps the most enlightening insights that I've gotten. It's been from the other side of the table. Okay, so resumes. The purposes of a resume. The purpose of your resume is really to be that first impression, but also to be the thing that sets you apart from the other people who have a resume. So I'm actually going to share my screen, and we're going to go through what I would call the golden rules of resume writing. We're going to then look at a few different resumes and make some judgments about what we think puts you out there the best, and we will go from there. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Oh, just one second. Here we are. The golden rules of resume writing. So I'm hoping you can see this on the screen. So the first thing is, oh, thanks, Keeper, for the thumbs up. Appreciate that. Who are you? Your resume needs to give your employer a real sense of who you are and what makes you stand out from the stack of resumes on their desk. I say this because there's a fairly good chance, depending on where you're at, that there will be a lot of people with almost identical experience to you. So especially if you're in high school, you're applying for a job, there's a fairly good chance that maybe depending on what it is, maybe you've done babysitting, paper route, maybe you have no job experience. If you're applying for a job and have no job experience, it's your first ever job, you're applying with a group of people who either have the same level of experience as you or more experience. And your only kind of asset at that point is for them to think that you in particular are a good investment in their company. So it needs to be something that stands out. And I can share this document as well with everybody here. So I don't feel like you need to scribble everything down. Happy to do that. So ways of standing out on your resume. There are many different approaches. It is personal of how you express yourself, but we're going to talk about what you say on your resume, because that's one of your primary ways of communicating about yourself. I have received resumes that have included pictures, and sometimes the pictures are great, sometimes they're over the top, like a headshot, for example. I have received resumes with a headshot or even a link to a portfolio. These are all techniques that some people will use. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. We're going to look at a few resumes that have gone over the top with their kind of amateur graphic design approaches, which look a little bit unprofessional, but there is a way of expressing who you are just using the conventions of resume writing. So never say the same thing twice, never say the same thing twice. This is a really important rule when we are talking about the experience that you include on your resume. So of course your resume needs to include your name, your address, your contact information, your education, your experience, your qualifications. Those are the big ones. And then your references. What you say on your resume, you may have several different experiences in the past that you might have done similar things. So maybe you worked at a grocery store and you also worked at a shoe store. And in both of those places, you were working at the cash. You should not tell the reader that you have experience handling cash at a till on both of those places. Once you've said it once, I now know that you have that skill. So if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of whoever the employer is, you need to understand that they need to get as much information as they can very quickly. And for you to say something multiple times is not a good use of your paper real estate. So as you'll see when we look at resumes, real estate is a word I use because if you have an employer who has a big stack of resumes, you have those, like, whatever it is, 2.5 seconds to make your impression. So that top of your front page is where you want to make sure that you're starting things on the right foot to kind of hook your reader into getting the rest of what you are and how you're expressing yourself. All right, let's talk about what and how. This is the biggest thing that I've noticed that people don't use to their full advantage. So when you're listing your experience, so for example, if you have a job as a babysitter, oh, you know what? I have an idea. I'm going to put another poll question on the screen for us, everybody. I would like to know what you think. You're now the employer. I'm applying to you. This is my question. In your opinion, which sentence best demonstrates that I am someone who can successfully manage and engage a group of kids? Here, it's the same experience said in 3 different ways, okay? One sentence, I have worked babysitting my cousins. In 2020, I worked as a weekly babysitter for 4 to 8-year-olds for 8 months. Or in 2020, I worked as a weekly babysitter for 3, 4 to 8-year-olds, engaging them using strategies such as preparing homemade craft packages, planning scavenger hunts with adaptations for the 4-year-old, and creating opportunities for structured free play. This is the same experience said in 3 different sentences. And yeah, we're all kind of, we got it. I'll share kind of, we've got the right answer there. And it's that what plus the how. Saying that you're a babysitter is something that everyone can say. If you were the employer, think about how much do you know about their skills as a babysitter just by the fact that they have worked as a babysitter. So saying that I worked as a babysitter, they could say, well, maybe they just sat on and watched TV the whole time. That doesn't tell me a whole lot. I'm now making assumptions as the person who's doing the hiring. Versus the second level is better. It's more specific. It tells me about what kind of kids you're used to working with and how much of an experience that is. So that's better. But the third one is the one that tells us how you were able to do the work, that the experience that you have. So preparing those homemade craft packages, planning scavenger hunts with adaptations for 4-year-olds. If you say that sentence, it tells me a lot about you. The fact that you are making adaptations for different kids based on their age tells me quite a lot about you without you just telling me. For example, some resumes will have a skills section at the top where you might list adaptable. If you were to list this under your experience, that's a proof of your adaptability. So and now it gives me something to ask you about in an interview. And then that third point there, creating opportunities for structured free play. I now know that you're aware of what free play is and how to structure it, and I might ask you about that. I'm now interested in you as a person, which these are questions that I might not have considered if you had just written, I have worked babysitting my cousins. So this is applicable to any kind of experience that you have, that it's about what you've done that's relevant, and let's talk about relevant in a second. What you have done, but how you have done it is where you're going to show off who you are. Because there are a million strategies of doing any given thing. Any task can be done a million ways. And if you can show me that you know the list of ways that it can be done, that tells me something about you. And it will also tell me something about your experience if you can point out the ways that you think would best fit what would work wherever you're trying to get hired. So in the case of babysitting, I list it because a lot of people have done babysitting in the past, and it's a pretty common experience to apply to a camp with, is babysitting experience. Tell me how you're babysitting. Just think about the different strategies that you do use. We're not making things up. Share who you are by telling me what you do. All right, so that's what and how. And I'll just read this paragraph here. When defining experiences, explain what you did specifically and how you did it. For example, when explaining babysitting experience, instead of saying take care of kids for my aunt, say prepare engaging activities for 3 children under 5, keep them engaged by providing simple incentives for cooperation, such as making a homemade snack. That example is proof. The evidence is really key here. Anyone can write words on a piece of paper, and you could lie, theoretically, but your lies will get caught with your references. And as someone who's reading a resume, if you imagine you're reading a resume, you're reading all these words knowing that they've just written these words. If you don't have evidence, you might not necessarily believe what they're saying. So having that how is your backup. It makes everything really reinforced. And we'll talk about how that applies to an interview. Be relevant. Okay, ensure that you have chosen to include experiences that are relevant to the position that you're applying for. So this depends on how much experience you've had. So if you have only ever had one job before, definitely list it, regardless as to what job you're applying for, because that proves that you've had a job. That is relevant at that point. But when you get to the point where you have a list of experiences that is, let's say, greater than 3, then you're going to need to start choosing the ones that are best suited to the position you're applying for. So one strategy that I use is a fairly common strategy, and that's that I keep something called a master resume, and then I create a resume specifically for whatever job I'm applying for. So I don't know if you can see this when it just came up. I just popped up a folder here. I'm not sure, did it come up? No, it did not come up. All right, well, what it is it's basically just a list of all the different resumes that I make. And your master resume, every time you have an experience, and this could be work experience, this could be volunteer experience, this could be perhaps it was maybe it was a mission trip, right? You can have a whole bunch of experiences that are relevant to different kinds of positions. You keep them in your master resume. And for each item, you would have the title and you would have the different ways of how that experience shows your skills. And then for a given position, you are going to choose the pieces of experience that best match whatever the position is. So when you're writing a resume, ideally, it is going to take a bit of work initially, but once you have kind of your template of your master resume, you can hopefully just delete the right things and then save it as a separate document. Don't oversave it. That's a mistake. But to think about what skills is my employer looking for when they are hiring for this position. That is the first question you always need to ask when you are applying for a position. What skills are they looking for? Skills are where it's at. So are they looking for good people management skills? Are they looking for organization? Colleen, I think I saw a hand there.
Just in this vein, and maybe you'll get to it, a top tip that I heard recently that I thought was really great was to look at the job description and use the same words that are in the job description in your resume.
Yep.
So if there are keywords, like go through the description, highlight the keywords, and then if you can demonstrate those qualities, say them in the same language the employer has said them in.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Make sure that you're on the same page, you're thinking about the same things. It makes you really appealing as a candidate because clearly you're exactly who they want. You have exactly the skills. It makes a lot of sense. So being relevant is part of that, and making sure that you know what the skills are that your employer is looking for. I'd like to ask a question to the group. Let's imagine that you think that the ideal employee at whatever job you're applying for is very organized. Okay, they're a very organized person. Have you heard the saying show don't tell? So this is like a drama saying, it's pretty common. And it's about proving what you're saying instead of just saying it, right? That's what show don't tell is. You show with your actions. What is a way that you could show in a resume that you're organized without just saying my skill is organized? Can you think of an idea? Oh, I'm going to go to Kiefer. Kiefer, go for it. So I'm moving first.
Maybe make the resume really organized, not just say you're organized, just like have different categories.
Absolutely. You have an organized resume. That's proof right there. You don't need to say it. You're organized. Ellie.
Also with that, know your resume and know it well so that when you go into the job interview and review it right before, so if they mention something on it and you've written it a couple months ago and you're like, wow, I don't remember that. So be organized also and be ready as though you're about to start your first day of class. Like you have everything needed. You have the knowledge, hopefully, of what you wrote down.
That's a great point as well, because you need to be prepared to answer questions about your resume. There's a good chance that one of the interview questions is about things you've said on your resume. Partially just like I would say it's fairly common for an employer to ask you a question just to make sure you've done what you've said on their resume, because they might be able to tell by what you've said, but also because hopefully you've written those interesting points in there about whatever it is, structured free play, and they're going to ask you about that time, and you're going to probably be asked for an example of that time, because your example is your proof. And so that might be the kind of thing where, like Ellie said, you review your resume, and if you could prepare examples to show some of those hows, that would be a really smart choice. Really smart, good advice. Okay, we're making our way through. I'm going to share it again. Okay, be concise. This is a long paragraph that says be concise. I'm hoping that it's obvious why. You want your resume to make its impression in 2.5 seconds, and then making sure that they can read through it without any redundancies. Make sure that you're reading through your resume over and over to make sure that it can be read really quickly and get to know you. Length of a resume. So if you have, so there are a couple different rules of thumb about this. One of them that I heard recently was if you have fewer than 10 years of experience, your resume should be like 1 page, like really short. If you have lots of relevant experience, 2 pages is fairly common for a resume. And 3 pages for those who have way too much experience at this point. But you should not go beyond 2 pages. In my opinion, as someone who reads quite a lot of resumes, it is something that you want to make sure you're paring down as much as you can, reread it over and over. If you're wondering about what can I get rid of, look at those different experience points. Are there things that I said twice? Okay, get rid of one of them from one of the spots. No problem with that. Ellie, question.
Yes, does the 2 pages, I don't imagine it applies to cover letters?
Correct. Yeah, your cover letter would be in addition. And we can chat about cover letters a bit too. Cool. All right, don't make it up. If you receive an interview, be prepared that the interviewer will probably ask probing questions into anything that stands out on your resume. It is entirely likely that the interviewer might also ask your references about your experiences. If you lie, it is over. No one wants to hire someone who lies to them. So don't lie on your resume. Feel free to say your experiences in a way that paints you positively. I think that's a good thing to do, but you should not just make things up, especially if you're just like listing fake education degrees and that sort of thing. That's a major problem. Don't do that. Oh man. I would say that if you're doing that kind of thing and someone finds out after you've been hired, that's grounds for firing almost right there. Like just the fact that you've done that. All right, Colleen,
Might also be grounds for fraud charges.
It is grounds for fraud.
What you lied about.
Absolutely. All right, a few more tips here for a successful resume, and then we'll look at a few, shall we? So formatting, clear, organized, easy to read. The font is professional and easy to read. The size is big enough to read, yet small enough to not waste space. I'm probably someone who overthinks the whole wasting space thing, but if you have that real estate of the top third of your first piece of paper, you need to make sure that it's not just white space there, but also doesn't look cluttered. So you need to kind of walk that fine line. Your resume sections. So resumes are organized with distinguishable headings. Most important / relevant information is given the prime real estate in the top third of the page. So when I'm so for example, I'll talk from my experience. I have my master resume and then I'm applying for a position. Let's say it's a position at camp. Okay, I'm applying for a counselor position. I'm going to prioritize in my experiences category that I'm going to prioritize the relevant information at the top, even if it is not entirely chronological. You could organize your relevant information chronologically, absolutely, but you should preference relevancy over making things chronological. If there's a big hole in your resume because you have a big irrelevant piece of information you didn't choose to include, I wouldn't say that's a reason why someone would not give you an interview. They might ask you about it in an interview, but being relevant is your top priority. Avoid wasting space. Use your margin and spacing controls to your advantage. So there are all kinds of great templates out there for resumes. whether they're for Word or Google Docs. Like you can just Google resume templates. There are all kinds of ways of doing it. But just be mindful, the space is quite important when you're trying to say everything about you in 2 pages or less. Content. You should not have any spelling or grammar mistakes at all. I know it seems a little bit judgmental, but it does say something about you if you have submitted a resume full of spelling and grammar mistakes. So you need to find someone who's going to peer review your essay. That's a really smart idea. The information presented is clear and concise. Each word has a purpose. Right, anything else here? Information is organized in an obvious organizational structure, chronologically or by relevance to the position. I would preference the relevance there, just personally. But it should be organized in some way that's clear for a stranger to read. I have a few sample heading combinations here that you're welcome to look at. The internet's also filled with good sample heading combinations. So there's ways for you to express yourself creatively. Let's just look at one or two, shall we? So here are some headings. I've got a bunch of different templates, but some of them have similarities. So your name and contact information right at the top. An objective? An objective. What should you say if you have an objective? Not all resumes need to have an objective. Sometimes it seems a bit redundant. I've read a lot of resumes that come in that say objective, to be hired, or something like this, where I know that, right? You're using up your valuable real estate. So if you have a particular, I would recommend something that you might write in an objective would be better stated in a cover letter. Your cover letter is typically a one-page document that you would send along with your resume that explains in complete sentences how you are a great fit for their organization and also why you're a great fit for their organization. All right, so here are some headings. We got education, work experience, volunteer experience, and you could, depending on what your position is. So for example, I commonly, if I'm applying for a teaching position, I will have a category that says teaching experience. And I will put the teaching experience in there, regardless as to whether it was paid or volunteer, right? That's just my teaching experience. It all falls into that. Awards and achievements, you could have certifications in here. It's relevant to know if you have your first aid or your driver's license. That might be helpful depending on what position you're going into. Hobbies and interests. Okay, clearly not the most important part of your resume, but I would say still valuable as part of your resume to include interests and hobbies in there, because remember, your goal of your resume is to stand out as being you. So the reader needs to know a bit about you. Your hobbies and interests are a great way of expressing that. But also, when I read resumes and I see hobbies and interests, sometimes there's a job or an opportunity at camp or wherever the job is, that is a small little piece that requires someone with a particular interest and skill set, but it's not big enough to be a real job, like a full-time job. So for example, I've had people who've applied and said, I have a passion for photography. All of a sudden, that's interesting to me because they've become one of the camp photographers and takes pictures every once in a while. So that's the kind of thing that might be relevant to put into your hobbies and interests, are things to show who you are completely honestly, to get them to know you. Maybe they have something in common that would be very helpful for you, but also it might be useful at wherever you're applying. References. Please make sure that your references have given consent to be a reference. Sometimes people will say, I never asked them to list me as their reference. I think Colleen and I were reviewing applications last year and someone listed God as their reference and listed a phone number, and Colleen called the phone number and someone, do you remember that, Colleen?
It was an excellent moment. I did call the phone number, and the person picked up was clearly at a party. And I was like, did you provide a reference for this person? They're like, I don't know that person. I'm like, well, that's what I expected, given that they said that you're God. Like, well, that's creative. So we didn't hire that person.
No, we didn't.
We didn't even interview that person.
No. Yeah, your references.
But it was,
yeah.
oh man.
Here's
So
something.
please
Yeah.
don't put God down as a reference. Is also a thing. We
Yeah.
will check it.
We'll check the God reference for sure. You just never know.
Yeah.
Someone else you should not include in your references would be immediate family members. So you shouldn't list your parents as your references because I'm going to assume that they're biased towards you getting your job. You should list someone who is has some kind of authority or seen you in a supervisory role. So whether that's at a past employer is a really good reference to have because that's going to tell me the most relevant information, or a past teacher, someone who's seen you in a student capacity, that's also great, or in a faith capacity. Maybe you've had a past minister or youth leader. That would be a good person. I have also had fair success getting to know some applicants by they've listed someone who was a relative, but more of a distant relative who've just known them for a long time, and I've been able to really ask them good questions because typically they want the best and have a good understanding of who they are. So list references who know things relevant to the position you're applying for is most ideal. Like if you were applying to a camp job and you had a supervisor who supervised you in a different childcare setting, that would be the reference I would call first. So be mindful of who you're putting as references, and also be mindful because you need the references. I'm always going to assume that you have chosen to pick someone who is probably going to paint you in a good light. Okay, just as a general kind of first place where I'm coming from. That's not always the case though when I call people, because some people haven't really clarified or haven't known that the reference is going to just be brutally honest that this person shouldn't be hired, because that happens where I get a reference and I call them and that they tell me that that person was fired from wherever it was or something for this reason. So don't pick that person to be a reference. You need to make sure that your reference is going to be someone who knows what you've been doing, has been in a supervisory capacity, and also you feel comfortable with all the work that you did for them, that they're going to paint you in a positive light. Do you have a comment on that, Colleen?
So I write a lot of references for people.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I value the most, if someone's asking me to either speak to their character or write a reference letter for them, is for them to tell me what I need, like what things I should highlight. So if you're applying for camp and I am your teacher and I happen to know that you do like a reading group with younger students. That's something that you want to tell your teacher. That's a thing that I want you to say, because otherwise it's so overwhelming to have someone ask you to be a reference and you're like, yeah, this person's great. But if you can give them some specific direction around what you would like them to highlight, it's going to be easier. You're going to have a more effective reference on both sides.
That's smart advice. Another thing that I thought was pretty smart is I've had people send me a template reference letter and ask me to edit it. Would you be willing to edit this reference letter and sign it? That would be really helpful for me. And that's helpful for me because I don't have to go through the trouble of writing a whole page reference letter, but also for you because now you have put words in my mouth that I have the opportunity to change, but might actually just sign off on them. So that's a little bit of a tip there. It takes a little bit more planning on your end, but there's nothing wrong with you sending a reference letter to someone and saying, would you mind just tweaking this in some way? It's less work and more likely to get you a really good result. So that's about references. Let's look at some resumes, starting with bad resumes, and then we'll talk about what makes a great resume, and we'll go from there. Okay, let me open it up for you. All right, so you're gonna laugh. This article is just like one of these articles you find on the internet of like bad resume examples. Here we go. The 6 worst resumes of 2020. Are you ready? Okay, the bad speller. All right, we talked about you shouldn't have obvious spelling mistakes. spelling server incorrectly isn't a very good sign. The amateur graphic designer, nice. Okay, so if we look at this resume, well, first, I mean, we could talk about it. I really like how there's a really clear name at the top. That's really helpful, but they're sacrificing huge real estate here with the shadow of their name. And then we have what, if you were to look at this as an employer from a first impression, well, you can make your own impressions on what your first impression is, but it looks a little bit like they're not a professional graphic designer, just based on the kind of clip art that they're throwing in there. Yeah, I've seen definitely more professional resumes. All right, so here's an example of one that doesn't tell us very many specifics about how they have done what they're doing. So here's some experience. So responsible for receiving calls from customers, tasked with updating clients on connection status, tried to create positive rapport with customers, use software to log customer feedback. This is all what? It's not telling me much about how they're doing these different things. So tried to create positive rapport with customers by, tell me something, right? Tell me something about how you're doing that. This is just about professionalism. They're talking about the font choice here. Fun is certainly, camp is one of the places where you can get away with the most amount of fun, I would say, compared to a lot of more professional positions. But you do want to stick to something that portrays you as being a professional in a job interview setting. And this applies to your resume, but also to your interview. So in here, it actually lists fonts you should avoid and fonts you should go for. And these are like the classic fonts that you see everywhere in professional settings. Oh yes, choosing what experience to list. This person is talking about their RuneScape clan history and all of their dedication to playing League of Legends. Think about what skills your employer is looking for. Yes, dedication might be that skill. Proving that you're dedicated to online gaming is maybe not the most relevant, depending on what you're applying for.
Can I jump in, Clayton?
Certainly.
So if you put founded one of the best RuneScape clans in history with over 400 members and 300 billion total XP in your hobbies and interests,
yeah,
that would make me really excited.
Yeah.
Because you haven't just said, I like PC gaming. You've said, I like this thing, and and I can get leadership or dedication from that in your hobby. Like, you've given me a specific behind that hobby.
Mm-hmm.
It should maybe not be a qualification. Or like, it's probably not relevant experience in most workspaces.
That's a good point. And I like how specific it is. I'll say that. And this is the autobiographer, right? So this is the 3+ page essay where it's just a lot to read. If you're applying for a position that has a lot of applicants, your resume should not take all day to read, like they say here. It should be concise as possible. Good resume, easy to read, error-free, focused on job seekers' relevant skills and experience. Avoid these things: grammar mistakes, disorganized, distracting, information isn't relevant, fails to highlight accomplishments, etc. I think it's time for questions about resumes before we talk about interviews. Any questions? Maybe I'll just share for a moment. I know, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from with this, and take it with a grain of salt, but I'll just share a bit of my resume just because it is the one I've spent most time with. So just so you can see kind of where I'm coming from with this. So here's a bit of my resume, and I agree it's too busy. I agree with you on that. And I've just blocked out my contact at the top. But I've just got your education, you include your dates, and then you'll see I've included the category teaching and educational leadership experience. And I've just listed the most relevant there. So this is my teaching resume. This is not my master resume. And you'll notice, like, I don't include my current job as executive director until the bottom of the experience because it's not direct teaching experience. For each of these, I have included a how in addition to the what. And something that I've enjoyed in some other resumes that I've added to mine is I've included hyperlinks. So for example, created a series of supplementary videos. I can click on that and go watch it if I wanted to. And I do have like a website, for example, that I keep some personal teaching information that I link to kind of at the top. Right. So I've tried to cater all of my information to being very teaching specific and making sure each bullet talks about something different that I do teaching. And it has been quite successful for me. And I've been asked quite a few questions and interviews about some of these different things that I would point out in my different points. And then I do include some additional experience that I think is loosely relevant. I don't include experiences that I had that aren't relevant to teaching. Like I worked for a long time in a box office and I've done property jobs and that sort of thing. I have included some certifications that are relevant. So I've got my teaching degree, my first aid license, and things that I think my employer might want in their school or their workplace. Some interests and hobbies, and then some references. I won't show you those too long because I think there's some personal phone numbers there. So that's a note as well. When you contact your references, make sure that they give their consent, but also ask them their preferred contact information that you'd like the person to contact him with. Any questions at all about resumes? All right. Well, feel free, I'll just say this, feel free to send a resume my way. If you'd like me to take a peek at it, I would be happy to do that and offer some feedback if I can. All right, so you've created a resume specific to your job. You've now been invited to an interview. Your interview, I mean, there are two types now, I guess, where you have your in-person interview and you have your Zoom interview, or the online version in 2020. Or there is a group interview as well, which is fairly common in, at least at camp. Camp we typically run with group interviews, though it's been online doing Zoom interviews. So let's first talk about that moment before your interview. How do you prepare for your interview before you're there? How do you prepare for your interview? Well, I'm going to tell you 3 questions that I've had on, well, versions of these questions on every interview. There have been these 3 questions. The first one is, who are you? Tell us about yourself in some way. Someone usually asks me that question. So you're going to have to tell whoever it is about yourself. And when you've been preparing for this interview, you're going to need to get to know a bit about what is the company that I'm applying for. What are they looking for? What skills do they want to see? And when you give that answer of tell us about yourself, you have a great opportunity there to tell specific examples of experiences that show off the skills that they're looking for. Examples is something that I'm going to stress, because having proof and evidence of the skills that they want you to have is going to be what sets you apart. And so coming prepared with the stories of things that you think would show off the skills that you think your employer wants to see, throwing those right in who are you is a way of starting things off on the right foot. So who are you is a question that you can prepare for. The second question that you can prepare for is, there's always a version of this kind of question of why have you applied? What makes you the right person for the job? What makes you the right person for this job? So you can prepare for that in advance by thinking about, what's the job description? Do you know it? Do you know what's required of the job? What experiences do I have that make me a good fit for that job? What experiences do I have that might set me apart from other applicants? So those are the 3 questions I might ask myself in preparing for what information and examples I might be prepared to say at the interview. So that was the second question. What makes you the right person for the job? Question from Ellie.
Yeah, I remember seeing something about interviews, and it's, instead of you asking them to hire you, it's them asking you to be hired. So like, it's more of like a, you want to hire me, not please hire me.
Yes, that speaks a lot to confidence as well, which is so key. The person who is the ideal person to be hired is likely a person who knows what they're doing and is confident doing that thing. Those are pretty good skills to have in any employee. So being that, coming into the mindset that when I go to my interview, my interviewer wants me to be amazing, whoever it is. And I can say that from someone who does the hiring. Whoever I'm interviewing, I want them to be amazing. Just like if you're auditioning for a play, the director hopes that you're the perfect fit. And you can come into there with that confidence to say, yes, I'm the perfect fit because of all of these things. Colleen, do you want to jump in?
We want you to be amazing. We both do.
We do.
It's not just Clayton. I'm not sitting there in an interview being like, I hope they suck.
No, consider
Just
it,
to be clear.
yes, consider it a supportive environment versus a judgmental environment in general. I've often seen people who I go into the interview, and it can be like, you notice I put the board table behind me because I've definitely been at interviews where I'm at the one end and they are at the other end. And it's a long, intimidating table, but they will still try to go out of their way to make you feel comfortable because they hope that you're the person they're hiring. They do hope that. All right, so that was the second question of what makes you the right person. And the third question that I have always been asked is, do you have any questions for us? So, okay, so you might discount that as being like, well, okay, well, maybe if I have questions, but there are some good questions that you can ask. There are some smart questions that you can ask. You can show off how much you know about the company in this time. So if you know something about a program that's being run, you could ask a question that shows that. I'm just going to read you a few questions that I've been asked when I'm doing the hiring that I thought were rather smart. So here's one question. I've been asked this question. What qualities are you looking for in an ideal candidate? Okay, so if I'm asked this question, now I'm inclined to give them a good answer. I asked if they had questions. I'm now going to outline all the things I'm looking for in an ideal candidate. And now that person, and I've had this happen, that person goes and tells me examples of how they are all of those qualities. So you've just identified all the things that I am actually looking for and told me how you are all of those things. So it's quite a smart question. And even if, as an employer, I'm thinking, wow, that was a really tricky question, right? They're trying to get through the interview process, but it also tells me that you are prepared for this interview and you're pretty smart. So it's a win question. What qualities are you looking for in an ideal candidate? Here's another good question that I've been asked. What is a challenge that you are trying to solve at Camp Menesetung, for example? What's a challenge that you're trying to solve? I'm now going to tell you a need that I currently have. So here's a problem that I am trying to figure out how to solve. If you have the solution to that need by me hiring you, that is a big incentive for me to hire you. So if you ask for what challenge I'm trying to solve, you might have a solution or a way that you can contribute. And the third question, that's a good question if it hasn't come up already, and when you're talking about your experiences, would be a question like, would you like to take a look at my portfolio or reference letters? Now, because when you're in the moment of an interview, it's kind of high anxiety sometimes. Maybe there's a lot of stress. Maybe your heart's beating faster than it normally would. Sometimes you just go through the interview and you forget that you had brought along with you some reference letters or a portfolio or whatever it is that you came prepared for in that interview. If you make a point of practicing asking that question, then you might actually be able to show them the things that you had hoped to show them in the first place. And a reference, and the more that they know about you, the more invested they are in you. I think that's true to say. So if you can show them as much as you can by showing them your portfolio, if you have one, it's not required for many positions, but there are some where a portfolio is helpful. So in a childcare kind of setting, if you've ever babysat kids or looked after kids and you had them fill out little exit surveys or something that was like, my teacher did great at this, or they could improve on this, and you have those, definitely bring them in if they're painting you in a positive light, because that tells you that you're, first of all, interested in learning, because that's a really big skill that I'm looking for. One of the skills that I think most employers are looking for is someone's good at learning and is willing to learn. I would say that in your interview. I am here willing to learn all of the skills that I don't have. That sets me as someone who's going to be teachable. Yeah, so those are some questions that you can prepare. Other interview tips. Let's think about this. So we said confidence. And I recently read a study that had some interesting evidence. And the study said that there is evidence to suggest that even sitting in a confident, open posture while waiting for your interview is likely to increase your interview performance. So if you can picture what a confident person would sit like, right? Just like thinking about those superhero poses, I guess, right? Really true confidence. There you go. Colleen is the model of superheroes right now. If you get into that mindset before your interview, it's apparently supposed to improve your interview performance and being confident in there and just being you and letting them know that. So that's just a little tip that I read. I have not done any studies on it, but there have been studies that have been done apparently. Interview tip, another one. Do not be afraid to take your time to think. Feel free after you've been asked a question, say something like, I need to take a moment to think about that, or to consider my answer, or take a sip of water. There is no judgment in you taking a minute to think. It perhaps actually shows me that you're willing to think before you act, which is maybe a good skill. Maybe a lot of us need to do that. Maybe I'm looking for that in an employee. So feel free to take that moment. It's showing how you're going to approach a problem. It's pretty common to get a scenario question in an interview. So there will be a specific challenge that they want to know how you would solve it. I know as an interviewer, and Colleen knows as an interviewer, that you're probably nervous. There's a good chance that you're nervous, actually. And we know that we don't function at our best when we're nervous. And we appreciate the fact that having time to settle yourself and think clearly is probably something that you have been able to train yourself to do in order to function at your best. And knowing that is in itself something that's positive about you. So please take the time to think. It's important. Oh, and yes, my last tip was just that your interviewers want you to be amazing. They're rooting for you. It's perhaps helpful to know that. Those of you who have been in an interview before, would anyone care to share how the experience went for you? Yeah, go for it, McKinley.
So my interview was at the bowling alley since I worked there. And it was like a fairly, I'd say like in an unprofessional setting because it was literally just at the front counter. And basically like the boss, he had my resume on the table and he was just asking me questions about it and like writing a bunch of stuff down on my resume and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So can you think of any, like was he asking questions about your experiences, like asking you to explain more?
Yeah, he was asking me about experiences and asking me to go into more detail about the experiences I had on my resume, mm-hmm. and also asking me about more about school and stuff.
Right on. Cool. Thank you for sharing.
No problem.
There you go.
Yeah, I did.
That's great. Anyone else? What have your interview experiences been like? Yeah, go for it, Kiefer.
Mine was kind of like that too. Like I just meant to walk in at Frankie's, which I work there now, and drop it off. But then apparently before that, I got suggested for it. Like,
yes.
Like someone said, like, oh, this. He was basically telling about me. So he already knew me, kind of. So the boss walked in, asked me a bunch of questions on the resume, and did the interview right there and now. And it was like supposed to be like 30 seconds, drop it off, go, and now, and then turned out to be like a 20 minutes being there.
That's okay. Kiefer's example is great. Thank you for sharing, Kiefer, because it speaks to something that's also a really important element of getting hired anywhere. And there is an element of who you know, and there is an element of being familiar, like having the person who's doing the hiring know something about you. So in some cases, it looks like Kiefer had someone who was what I would call his sponsor at the table, right? His person who's advocating for Kiefer. And if you can find a sponsor, then you are going to have a very good chance. Though we would hope that all hiring processes are incredibly unbiased, right? We try to make it built so that it's possible for anyone to be hired regardless as to whether they've got that unfair foot in the door. but it is an advantage to have your employer know who you are, and from a trusted source is an even better advantage. So I have been asked in the past, is there value in volunteering in the place that I want to work? So this is, I think there are people who are against this because of the precedent that it sets for employers to rely on volunteers and not paying them, etc. But there is an advantage to having someone know you and for you to not have to cost your employer to train you for things you already know. So if you are volunteering at the place that you hope to work and you have done some of the skills that your job requires already and your employer knows this, that's going to be a leg up for you because you're already trained. So that's the pros and cons to that question. Certainly there's value in going in and saying hello and making yourself known that you really want to be there. I care about this place. I live here, and you know, you're into it. There's value there for sure. Any other questions about anything? Oh, maybe I'll speak to group interviews and how that has gone at camp a little bit. Because at camp, we typically hire around 30 different employees every season, and we have what I call our frontline staff, who are the people who are in the field working with the campers as counselors and program staff. And in the past, how we've run it is we've had a group interview, which is also partly a private interview. So you come for an interview day, you spend 4 hours doing group interview, team challenges, and brainstorming exercises, and then you're pulled out one at a time for a private interview where you're asked interview questions, perhaps more like a conventional interview. During the group interview time, how we run it at our camp is we actually have a small group of observers who have specific people that they're observing during the group interview team challenges, looking for skills. That's what we're looking for in an interview, is looking for those skills of your ideal camp counselor. And perhaps we could think of some of those skills, right? So someone who is engaging, someone who is caring, someone who's willing to work on a team really well. You can see quite a lot of those skills when you're having to complete a challenge with other people who you think perhaps you're even feeling a bit competitive because you're in a group interview. But if you are the person who's going out of your way to make sure other voices are heard and trying to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity, that's saying something about you as well. So thinking about how your actions speak in a group interview setting is helpful. It is also important for you to advocate for yourself, because it is possible in a group interview setting for you to become lost because the loudest voices are often dominant. So finding a way for you to set yourself apart by either volunteering for something or to have a perspective that's different can be something that just even allows the attention to shift over to you for a moment and to let people appreciate what you bring to the table. Colleen.
Yeah, just another note about group interviews is that your interview starts the moment you walk in the door.
Mm-hmm.
So we will have a all right, the group interview has started kind of, but it started as soon as you walked in the door. It started when you showed up on time. Mm-hmm. Or a little early, but not too early, because we also take that into account. So it's important to always, when you're sitting in that circle before the interview starts, if you're the one engaging with other people, I notice that, or Clayton notices that. And that kind of thing. So that's something to be aware of in a group interview setting. We don't know what that looks like this year, just as a heads up. Mm-hmm. We have not figured out how or if that's a possibility to do a group interview this year. So we'll see what happens down the line a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Colleen.
If you're applying for camp.
Yes, of course. And I think the big takeaway of both the resume and the interview that I'm trying to get across is the whole show don't tell, is making sure that how you express yourself is more important than what you say. And I think that it speaks a lot to who you are and your experience and your skills. And hopefully you're thinking about what experiences would be good for your future dream job. If you have a career goal in mind, think about what kind of experiences might be helpful on that path. So people typically, like for example, I have gotten the teaching job because someone looked at my resume and saw that there was a lot of camp on it. Like that's because it's proving that you're a testament that you've committed your summers to working with kids. This says something about you. So, any questions about anything at all before I turn it over to Colleen? All right, we're right on time. It's been an hour. Go for it, Colleen.
Perfect. Well, I'm just going to jump in with a couple little things because you are here and you showed up for this, or you're watching the recording. A few little bonus things to know. One of those things is if you have prior camp experience, so if you're someone who is returning to camp for a second summer in any capacity, so whether you're going from LIT to CIT or CIT to staff or staff to staff, I know that you worked at camp last summer. However, I do want to know what you learned and what you accomplished at camp that summer, and what makes you different or what you've learned since the summer. So those are the things that I'm looking for. So you don't have to tell me what you did at camp in terms of I supervised a cabin or this or that, because I know that I was there. But I do want to know what stood out, what you learned, those kinds of things. So those are some things for you to know because you are here and watching this. There's a little bonus tip of what I want to know from folks who are returning is that I want to know how you made an impact on camp and then how you grew over the last 3 or 4 months. So there's my bonus tip. My second bonus tip is perhaps more general. References available upon request just takes up space. We know that. We requested them. You have them somewhere. So, or if you're talking to a different employer, they'll request your references if they want them. Don't put that line on there. You don't need it. It just takes up valuable real estate, as Clayton was saying. So those are the two bonuses. I don't know if they still tell you to put references available upon request. Maybe schools have stopped telling you to do that. But they did tell me that when I was in elementary school and high school.
I was told that too, Colleen, when I was in elementary school, first making my resume. I would say send your references.
Right, just give your references.
Give your references. Absolutely.
And if you don't have them, start lining them up for when they're requested rather than telling your employer that you will bring them when they are requested.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just add something to know if you're planning on applying for camp. You've just gone through a resume and interview process kind of webinar kind of thing. For camp, we actually have an application that we have you complete. And the application asks a lot of the questions that you would normally say on a resume. So developing a resume for our camp application is an optional thing because the information is already on the application. We've asked perhaps more detailed questions on the application. So just bear that in mind. A resume is an optional thing for our camp application.
If you give us a resume, however, that might be an opportunity throughout the summer if you're interested in one or both of us looking at it and helping you tweak it and improve it. So it's well worth adding the resume if you can. It also does, well, I like to see it. I will say that I like to see it. If I see a resume, that does make me feel like you're taking a little bit of extra time, but not having a resume doesn't jeopardize your chances.
And it's also just really good practice to work on your resume. To just get it going. You're going to use it a lot, hopefully, and it's something that we can always work on. So create that master resume and that separate resume for whatever you're applying for. Just do yourself a favor and start creating all those experiences that you've had. Think about what and how you can show, not tell.
Sorry,
Colleen, go ahead.
I heard a really cool thing about the master resume the other day. Someone else that was talking about it calls it a brag file, which I just thought was a really fun name. But what they also do is they have a tag in their email where they tag if they get an award, or if someone sends them an email that says you did great at this thing, you were like, thank you for doing this thing, or if they're recognized or appreciated, or anything that like might be helpful in a job interview resume space, they just tag it brag file. So they can go back and then just have all these emails that say great things about them or talk about their accomplishments, which I thought was a really, really cool thing to do. And like, just like enhancing that master resume.
I love that. I think that's a great idea.
Isn't that cool? I
Yeah.
thought that was such a cool thing. I'm like, I'm definitely doing that.
Yeah. And you never know what kind of job you're actually going to apply for out there. Like, there are so many crazy jobs. I can remember a summer when I was like early in university or something, looking for jobs, and I was like, well, I'll just apply to these ones because they're local to me. And one was like a museum curator person, the other one was like a jet boat tour guide. Like, who knows? Like, you can tweak your resume, and if you have that master resume, you can filter all of those things easily.
I'm thinking about Clayton, the jet boat tour guide.
I didn't get that job. No. I'll also just share something that I have done. It has been a bit helpful for me, is that any resume that I have used where I have gotten hired using it, I've put that resume into a folder called successful resumes, and just looked at those as things that might have worked.
What I thought was interesting is that Clayton and I do resumes really differently. So Clayton has, his is very like, this is the job, this is the stuff from the job, where I do what's called a skill-based resume, where I talk about the specific skills and then list the jobs at the end. So I'll have like United Church relevant experience, camping relevant experience, what academic relevant experience, and then talk about those things, but they're not specific to each individual job. They're specific to kind of an overall experience picture. And I would say if you don't have a huge list of jobs or experience in a particular professional field, this is a really good way to lay out your resume, because it highlights what you're really good at. And then you can talk about the jobs at the end. And it also keeps you from repeating yourself. So I just have a list of like the, job, date, location, etc., that I just list at the bottom.
Different approach.
Which is a different approach.
Yeah.
But it seemed to work on Clayton. He hired me.
There you go. All right. If there are no other questions, I want to just say thank you for coming on out this evening and joining us. I hope that you have perhaps taken away a tip or two that you can use in a practical way, and maybe you'll apply to camp or somewhere else and get a job. I hope it goes well for you.
Yeah. I would also, if you have some time in the next little while, send me a note on things that you might think are interesting to talk about for like a teen and LIT and staff set of sessions. So I've been thinking about some stuff around self-care. I went to a women in camping summit last week, so I've been thinking about doing something around that. And we've been talking about maybe doing a session on like meals you can cook in a dorm, and that kind of thing. So if you think of anything that you would be like, this would be a really fun thing that we could do as a camp group, send those suggestions my way, because we're hoping to do a monthly thing. So hopefully this is the first of many times we're able to gather and just connect over the next little while.
That sounds great. Choice-based catered professional development free on a monthly basis from camp. Ah, yeah, here we go.